Hello everyone, this is Tyler here. I'm here in Estonia, and I'm going to discuss with you guys the role that Germany has had in the growth of MGTOW philosophy in Europe. As we all know, Germany is a major player in Europe. It's a major player, in fact, in the world. And it's obviously been one of the major growth economies of the 20th century and also 21st century. And it has a very noteworthy presence in the growth of MGTOW worldwide. As we know here, Germany's had an interesting history. They, of course, became one of the major players during the middle 20th century, and they took a massive hit, of course, right after, and then they were able to regroup and regrow pretty quickly, economically speaking, and they became one of the major powerhouses by the end of the 20th century. And this was both good and bad for Germany. Unfortunately, for our relationships, it was pretty treacherous, honestly. It had a really massive impact on gender relations and on the relation between men and women. If anyone knows anyone from West or East Germany, it actually used to be very optimal, especially in East Germany, for relationships. It was a very good place. Many foreign guys actually would go to Germany from other countries to meet a girlfriend. Maybe they were based there, they were in the military, they were there for travel, whatever it was. And they would always speak very positively about the relationship scene in Germany. It was phenomenal, honestly. Back at that point, the ladies were very feminine. They were much more traditionally minded, and they were just nicer. I mean, they were just good partners, honestly. They had both the good traits of the Germans, and they also had the good traits of an European. So it was just all around a great country for this. But unfortunately, like in much of Europe, it very quickly declined. And I think Germany probably became one of the first countries in the early 2000s to really experience a decline in contentment for guys pursuing relationships, in relationships, or seeking one. It just went down big time. And if anyone knows anyone from Germany, they will tell you that the German guys were actually some of the first guys en masse, just like in the US or Canada, to start looking elsewhere for partners, girlfriends, wives. There were many guys looked to Central Europe and Eastern Europe, very common. Places like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, these places. And then there were some that looked to Asia, like Southeast Asia, East Asia, and also Latin America. And some German guys actually, especially if you go back to the 90s, were actually even probably more interested in women from the US than from their own country. I know at my university, in fact, when I was in Minnesota, there were actually a couple from Germany that had very attractive girlfriends from Minnesota. In summary, these guys have gone everywhere seeking relationships. Not necessarily just for relationships, but this has been a major problem for many guys in Germany now for some time. For this reason, Germany has kind of gained this reputation as being a country where the guys look elsewhere in Europe, because it's just a major issue. As we see in other countries that have these very developed economies, that have very big governments, and they have large welfare programs, it tends to have the same consequences that dating life for men takes a big hit, and this is definitely the case in Germany. And like I said, the German guys, they've been looking elsewhere now for quite some time. Now other guys, though, whether they live in Germany now or they live elsewhere, are MGTOW. This segment has grown tremendously. Understand that German guys, so I should first note this, German guys tend to have very high S&B wherever they go. In the countries that I have lived, the German guys tend to have some of the highest S&B. When I lived in Chile, Argentina, US, Russia, Estonia, in all the other countries that I've traveled to, they've always had a high S&B. I think the probably most popular country that I lived where they were the most sought after was Russia. That was probably the best country if you're a German guy. And This was a country I know that many German guys actually like to go to now for travel or to even live. These guys, fortunately, do have high S&P, but other German guys, even if they can, they just prefer not to have these relationships and to be married. And they go this MGTOW route, which is also just as good. It's also an excellent option. And of course, you can be both. You could date and also be a MGTOW guy. These German guys kind of have realized that it's maybe not worth it. Whether they're living at home or abroad, the relationships are difficult. Now, to focus on German guys living at home domestically, Germany, like I stated before, this is a core center point of Europe. The European Union is very much has a huge presence in Germany. Germany is one of the major countries that has a lot of impact, influence on this European Union that basically covers many countries around Europe. Also, a lot of the source of ideals, new trends, technologies, and sciences stem from Germany. Germany is very much a center point for all of Europe. And this is absolutely the case with relationships. Germany, of course, has made it really difficult for guys, though, that are in relationships or seeking or in marriages. They have systems, their law system, legal system with marriage and divorce and child custody is relatively similar to the US. It's a little different, but in terms of who gets priority and who gets primary custody of children and the child support and all this is very much biased towards one gender here, and I think we all know which gender that is. And this is, of course, became a big problem for German guys, and they continued. Many guys don't want to play in the system. It's a huge, obviously, like revolving door. And I think the other big issue in Germany, the German mindset is a little different than the Anglo mindset. I've obviously spoken on most of the English Commonwealth country and US. These countries have a little different ideal of the welfare system and tax system. German guys here perhaps may understand this a little better here. The tax system in Germany actually is probably one of the, if we look back in history, they were probably one of the first societies, countries that were more communal minded. And this is in fact where some of the history of their socialist movement, communist movement, this is actually where some of it stemmed from. Because unlike the Anglos, the Germans were not as individualistic minded. Historically speaking, they were very much more communal minded, like the Scandinavians. And this also had a big impact on the tax system and welfare system of their country. They were one of the first societies to have a large welfare type of system. And this goes back decades and decades ago. In historic times, it worked. It, of course, wasn't perfect. I mean, many people here would obviously have different opinions on this, but this was designed, at that time, that system was designed in a way that was for those times. It was designed also for a primarily German people. People that were actually ethnically German. Keep that in mind here. And most of these people went to work, they supported their families, they functioned in a very disciplined way, and they raised the next generation, and the next generation carried on, and they were on a whole very productive society. And the tax system and the welfare system at that time, it was very reflective of the German mentality. Some of these areas then carried over into the modern era. Some of it worked, but much of it didn't work because this mindset didn't work for this new structure that was put in place. Old Germany is quite different from the new Germany, and one of the big areas, for example, is in demographics. If you go to larger German cities, demographically, many people are not ethnically German. So when you start looking at how the welfare state plays into that, you see something kind of similar to US or England. Family structures and family support system is viewed differently than it was decades ago. At one point in time, of course, the women were much more encouraged to be with good quality, solid guys, and were much more likely to be loyal, to stay with them in marriage and have kids, of course, and they were together for life, or for at least until the kids were grown. And this is how Germany was. So this system, it was just viewed differently. I think Germany was a situation where the higher taxes historically was much more accepted by the masses than even other European countries. People just had a different mindset with it, and they understood that it was being used to create a greater Germany, to create a better nation, and to produce a better country, better infrastructure, and overall better technology and science. It was very well understood, and it was very circular. Most people are actually benefiting from this system, and unfortunately this system, some of this model, was then parlayed into the modern era, and this obviously didn't work too well, because the biggest reason, as I said, was the demographic change, but also the gender relations, what the expectations were with relationships and marriage in the areas of traditionalism that existed years before did not extend into this new era. There wasn't this same natural code of honor and of morality in place, which obviously produced many problems when it came to relationships and marriages. Descendants of these earlier periods started obviously having problems. The Germans also, from a long time back, as I pointed out, they produced a very well-off society economically. They were probably one of the first European countries to effectively recover after World War II, and were able to greatly rebuild. And this, of course, also was powered by all the Western money that was being used to rebuild their country from the bombings and the war that took place. And they recovered, they rebounded, and they produced a very well-off country. And it was very incredible how much they recovered. But as I said, this prosperity created problems. I think one interesting thing we could look at is how East and West Germany developed and evolved, and you can kind of look at each of these situations and get an idea of how in one place they were very economically developed, but relations had taken a toll. In the other place, not as much so economically developed, but there was still a lot more gender traditionalism in place. And I think this also demonstrates, unfortunately, in almost any society, what happens is innovation, as a country overall becomes more wealthy, how it impacts the gender norms and what's expected when they couple into a relationship, what's brought to the table. I think it was much more egalitarian, much more equal, like in historic East Germany compared to West Germany, where for a long time I think guys just generally had to bring more to the table. The bar was lifted higher starting further back, years back. In fact, many guys from West Germany, just like East Germans went to West Germany, many West German guys then went to East Germany after the Berlin Wall fell, because it was better for relationships. It was actually very noticeable. Like this little divide, actually, there was a huge difference in terms of the overall quality for a guy and what they could obtain over in East Germany. Now, mind you, that was some years ago. And I have a former coworker at my old company back in Chicago, and he actually went to Germany in the early 90s, right after the collapse. And he went to both West Germany and East Germany, and I inquired to him about the difference in the ladies at that time in both countries, and he told me, Tyler, like, there's a huge difference in these two countries. You could very much see it at that time, right after the Berlin Wall collapsed. It was very noticeable, especially if you got further into East Germany, closer to the Polish border. This is just kind of an interesting social experiment. You can see kind of how what happens as a country, two similar groups of people, and how things play out if the systems that they're under operate in a different way, essentially. Germans have produced many of the greatest philosophers that unfortunately they don't get highlighted nowadays. And I won't go through specifically through the list, but many of you guys may know about some of the famous philosophers that have done gender research starting in the 1800s. And unfortunately, during the early 20th century, much of this history was very much omitted from mainstream media. These guys very much took kind of a back seat. There was a huge... The mainstream media in the West at this time, like in US, really wanted to suppress these ideals from reaching the masses. And these guys actually, these German philosophers and psychologists, were some of the first to begin originating ideals of gender and of basic psychology. This is very fascinating. Now, religion kind of took a back seat now for many decades. This is actually one of the reasons I suspect why MGTOW philosophy rose so quickly on in Germany, or something similar to MGTOW, because I think many guys already were MGTOW in Germany earlier on. They just didn't really maybe understand what it was called, due to the fact that the religion really was not in place in Germany. I think this MGTOW philosophy was kind of a substitute for many guys, and this is actually, unfortunately, many of these famous psychologists, philosophers were replaced by the likes of guys like Sigmund Freud. The guys like Sigmund Freud were very much highlighted more than, I think, were much more innovative and independent-minded philosophers and psychologists. I'm not going to get into why this happened. I think most of you guys realize why this happened, what the agenda there was. But these German philosophers and psychologists, I think, very much laid down the foundation in terms of the real tendencies of males and females and how they respond to environments and just the overall way of operating and per their gender. There's a lot of complex science here, and I think these guys actually were so far ahead of their time. These guys, I know, have been highlighted by some of the MRAs and PUAs, and I think they also did play a role in the foundation of MGTOW philosophy and everything that's understood and what happens with a system when a certain gender is given free rein to do what they want. They understand that there's not going to be rules followed, and there's not going to be a natural set of ethics here in the tendencies of this gender. And this is obviously where Germany was very, very much ahead of their time. These German philosophers and psychologists understood this way before most of these other nations did. And it's so unfortunate that their writings and their publishings were so overlooked. They were suppressed. They were pushed out of the mainstream for so long because the people that were running these societies, countries in the world, didn't want these publishings being released to the masses because they understood this was the most red pill publishing at that time, and this would have really had a large impact on the masses. And so a lot of this, especially going into the 19th or going into the 20th century, was really pushed aside. It was very much suppressed, in my opinion, but indeed helped set the foundation for MGTOW philosophy in Germany. One of the biggest areas, obviously, that Germans are renowned for is their advancement with innovation, science, and technology. And this is where I think they were so far ahead of their time, just like the Japanese. They very much have been world-renowned as engineers, as scientists, in medicine. And this also meant that many roles that were once being done in the home, in personal life, that the woman was responsible for, wasn't needed. This was actually, there were solutions here, alternatives through science and technology that replaced this, and this is where I think the Germans really paved the way for the 21st century in this sense. They of course have been a big player in robotics and microchip industry, and will probably continue in the near future this way. Germany obviously has a lot of aspects to it. This is a very complex society, and they're way ahead of their time. And I look forward to your feedback below. And this is just the first segment here. I'll be doing a follow-up. So thank you.